final thing I wanted to show you was I wanted to show you a couple of examples of how to call Web API services. Okay? Let's show you an example of how to be a client. I'll show you a .NET example, and then I'll show you a traditional Synergy example, and then we'll call it a day. So what we'll do first of all is we will create a sample client. Let's close everything down here. First we'll do a .NET one. So I'm going to add a new project. Again, I'm just going to do a console application, but whether it's a web app, a desktop app, or whatever, it doesn't matter. You're going to do this exactly the same way. And I'm going to add a new project, and again, I'm going to add a Synergy console application, and we'll call this one, let's call it Test Client Net. So this is a Synergy.NET console application. We are going to need reference to some networking stuff in the .NET framework. So I'm going to add a reference to the framework assembly system.net.http. That's the .NET framework's HTTP stuff. Okay, so we'll get access to that. I'm also going to want to do some JSON serialization and deserialization probably. So I'm going to add a reference to Web API services simply so that I can go after the model classes. Now this isn't normal. What I would generally recommend you do is if you're writing clients and servers, those model classes are going to be useful on both sides. So normally you would split the model classes into a separate assembly so that you can easily reference them from the client as well as the server. So I'm going to reference it just to get access to the data classes, just to save us a little bit of time. And we are going to be using the JSON stuff. So I'm going to go to our Manage NuGet packages. I'm going to look at the packages that are installed. Oh, it was right on the top of the list there. Look, Newtonsoft JSON, 56.7 million downloads. So we'll add that into our test client net. So we've got a way of serializing and deserializing the data. Okay, let's edit program.dbl. We're already in there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to generate a class to be a client to this thing. I'm just going to do it all in the same piece of code. Now you don't have to do it this way. If you just want to start using the HTTP client inline, you absolutely can. But I like to create a little OO API that I just make a call to the service and off it goes. So in that class, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a helper method that is able to make generic calls. There's really two types of calls. If I'm retrieving information, that's all I'm going to look at right now. There's calls that return one and calls that return many. So I'm just going to write a generic piece of code that is able to call a web service function that returns a collection of employees in this case. So again, this code I'll make available later. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but essentially I've got a class called employee service client. It knows about the base URL that I'm going to be talking to as the server, and I have a method called doGetMultiple. The reason I'm doing this way is the HTTP client requires that you use it in an asynchronous pattern. Okay, so these are asynchronous method calls. So this is an async method that can be called doGetMultiple. You pass it in a URL, and here we're creating an HTTP client. We're creating an HTTP request message, we're setting the URI, we're telling it to do a get, we're calling the send async method and getting a response, and then we're looking at the status code that comes back and says if it was not found, we'll return an empty collection. Otherwise, we'll use Newtonsoft JSON to go get response content, read as string async, returns the JSON that was returned, and here's a call to Newtonsoft JSON to deserialize it into a list of employee. Okay, typical steps. Set up the URL, set up the HTTP call, make it, what's the response status, deal with the data. Okay, yes, it's somewhat of a more manual process than with add service reference and things like that. That's the way that REST generally works. I'm just looking for anything else that might, that one. Oh, list of task, threading tasks, HTTP status code, just bringing in all the references that we need. Okay, so there's our simple client. So there's a private helper method that actually does the work, and then I've got a public async method, get employees in state, that returns a list of employees, and it calls the private helper method with the base URL and /state and a value of whatever it's trying to do. So I could implement one of these little methods that calls this for all of the different operations in the service that return a collection of employees. And then basically what we're going to do is we're going to call it from the outside. So back in our program, we're just going to add a bit of code that basically says data client is a new employee service client. E is an employee. It's an asynchronous pattern, so this is one way of dealing with an asynchronous method call in a console application. We fire off the asynchronous method and then wait for it to complete. Doing this is only something you should do in a console app. There's different ways of calling asynchronous methods from other kinds of, WPF applications and things like that. You wouldn't want to do it this way. But this will work in a console application. And then we get our result back. So the important stuff here is this. This is what's doing the work. We're creating an instance of HTTP client. We're creating an HTTP request message, setting the URL, setting the method, setting any headers that we need to send, setting the body if we're doing a post, what data are we sending, and so on. And then send async is an asynchronous call that goes off and fires it and comes back when it's done. Okay? If we build that, now all I'm doing in here is I'm making the call, waiting for the asynchronous method to complete, and then iterating through the results, basically, and just displaying ID, first name, last name. Remember, we're getting JSON back from the call, but we've used Newtonsoft's JSON convert deserialize object to turn the JSON string into a collection of employee objects. And if we run it, we need to set it up for the startup project and hit go, and there's the data. Okay, very simple example of how to be a client. I'm going to do one more example, and that example is if you're in traditional Synergy land and you want to be a client to a RESTful web service. So we're going to say solution, add, new project. This time I'm going to go for a Synergy traditional DBR, and let's call it test client DBR. All we're going to do is we are going to use the HTTP API. So that's related to the XML API. So we bring in synxml.def to get the definitions that we need. I'm going to define some data in our data division. Because we're in traditional Synergy now, we shouldn't be using nasty things like data statements. Ugh. So we've defined a terminal channel, HTTP error code, a response string, error text string, an array of headers that I'm going to send, and an array of headers that I'm going to receive, because the HTTP API requires that we provide and receive headers. And then we're just going to write a little bit of code. I'm going to dump the whole lot in there, but this is traditional Synergy, so we all know how to read this stuff. And all we're doing is we're saying open the terminal channel. I'm setting the send headers to a new array of string with two entities. Send headers 1 is host, is localhost. You have to have a host header. Send headers 2, accept application XML. I'm in Synergy and I don't have a JSON parser, so I'm going to request XML so I can parse it with the XML API. Then here's my method call. So this is the call to the web service. We're calling the URL with a 2-second timeout. We're grabbing the response code. We're grabbing the error text if it's an error response. We're sending our array of headers. We're receiving back an array of headers that it comes back with, so we can see what the content length was and stuff like that. I'm logging the results into a log file, and we're using HTTP 1.1, basically. Just a standard HTTP GET call. This is the version 10 version that's dealing with strings instead of memory handles. If you're in version 9, you'd have to use HTTP client GET, and you'd be doing dynamic memory for the data to be sent and dynamic memory for the data being received. But other than that, it's basically the same thing. And then I'm just saying if HTTP error, display the error text, otherwise display the response. So I'm not going to parse out the XML, you could do that, but the response will have XML data in it, hopefully, and then we'll wait for a key press. So we will set that as the startup project. We will build it. and we will run it. It comes back with the XML, which is, what did we request from it? Departments for Manager 1089. I think there were 2 of them earlier, weren't there? So, accounting and human resources, yeah. Okay, so that's an example of calling Web API or any RESTful web service from traditional Synergy if you want to. And clearly, you know, doing posts and puts and stuff is somewhat more complex because you've got to deal with sending data and receiving data and all the headers and that kind of stuff. But it's still a very basic concept. Once you understand the basics of what is a post versus a delete versus a put and what do you have to do in each scenario, then you can pretty much call any RESTful API out there. In my opinion, if you want to get into doing web services, really doing RESTful API, to me, is kind of a no-brainer these days. From an ease point of view, it is very, very straightforward. It's easy to learn and use. It's fast, you know, it's high performance. There are potentially some more hosting options than you had in the past with things like WCF. I just think it's a no-brainer. I've done all nature of web services for a number of years now, and this is the best environment I've ever seen. If you're interested in this stuff, I strongly encourage you to go out and learn a bit more about it. There's all kinds of, you know, go look at Channel 9, Microsoft's videos, go look at the Build Conference videos, go look at YouTube and just Google or YouTube Web API. You'll find a ton of online resources. If you've got Pluralsight access, there are 2 or 3 pretty good Pluralsight courses on Web API, and there's some really good stuff in there for Web API Core as well if you're interested in the .NET Core environment. And that's it. What I would say is we've covered a lot of different ground today, but we really did just touch on the basics. It is a very extensive environment. There is all sorts of stuff you can do to plug in and have it do for you automatically. You know, we saw examples of plugging in model validation and things like that. That's just really scratching the surface. There's an awful lot you can make this environment do for you. I'm aware that we didn't touch on important subjects like authentication and authorization. There is support in the environment for doing OAuth or based authentication and all kinds of things. We mentioned earlier, you know, the Active Directory authentication. All of those things are present in the API, but there's just too much to get to in the context of a day like this. Thank you very much for your attention. Hope you enjoyed it.